Good evening, and thank you all so much for coming. I know it's really, really busy, and I'm particularly delighted to see familiar faces from classes past as well as present, so thank you. I appreciate it. Okay. A decade and a half after Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, voicing the complaints of white housewives who lived in the stifling doldrums of 1963 Suburbia, the Combahee River Collective, a group of black feminist lesbian activists, published a powerful statement that excoriated their exclusion from the concerns of white liberal feminism. Even more importantly, it laid out a sophisticated intersectional analysis of racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppressions that black women endured. Feminism has become much more inclusive since 1977, not least because of the insights of that statement, of that analysis. But there are many recent examples that show that white women and women of color still struggle to recognize common ground, to acknowledge each other's different concerns, and to work collectively. And I'll give you just a few quick examples of that. In my own field, women historians of color have repeatedly called out white scholars who try to apply their theoretical templates universally, as though all women have the same shared experiences. Another example, black women found few white allies among the organizers of the Women's March of 2017, because those organizers worried that maybe we were paying a little too much attention to race. Few white women turn out for Black Lives Matter rallies, but then they expect black women to turn out in record numbers for their women's marches. The Me Too movement, founded 12 years ago and still led by Tarana Burke, a black woman, didn't gain traction until white Hollywood celebrities started to talk about their experiences of sexual assault. There has been a long history of mistrust, antagonism, and even violence between white women and black. That hostility was fostered deliberately by male European settlers in 17th century America who invented a system of race on top of the infinitely older systems of gender, and then wove those strands together so tightly in both custom and law that it's impossible to separate them, even today. So as I studied the lives of Jefferson's daughters and granddaughters, I could see the ugliness of this system playing out in the bucolic beauty of Jefferson's home and within a single family. Jefferson was the master of this and other plantations, but he preferred to rule with a velvet glove, by persuasion rather than force, encouraging acquiescence to his benevolent will rather than confrontation. In doing so, then, he forced his daughter Martha and her daughters to do the work of maintaining the boundaries between black and white, free and enslaved. And so in performing whiteness, his female family members did the daily work of enforcing slavery. And while they derived some clear benefits from this work, there is no doubt that the ultimate beneficiary was Jefferson and the perpetuation of his authority in this patriarchal system of slavery. And so we thought that perhaps looking at this dynamic from the past might be useful in thinking about our situation today. Thomas Jefferson had 3 daughters, Martha and Maria by his wife Martha Wales Jefferson, and Harriet by his slave Sally Hemings. And this family tree outlines the connections between the Wales, Jefferson, and Hemings family. And so here are some things that I want you to see. So John Wales is sitting at the top of this simplified family tree. He married Martha Epps. Together they had Martha Wales. Martha Wales married Thomas Jefferson. Together they actually had 6 children. 2 survived Martha, born in 1772, and Mary Maria, born in 1778. When Wales's 3rd wife died, he took as, and I'm using a phrase from one of Jefferson's neighbors, he took as a substitute for a wife his slave Elizabeth Hemings. And he had a relationship with Elizabeth Hemings until he died. They had 6 children together. The youngest was Sally Hemings, born in 1773, the year in which Wales died, right? So there are 2 things that I want you to notice from this family tree. The first is that Martha Wales, the wife of Thomas Jefferson, and Sally Hemings, who will have a total of 6 children, 4 surviving with Thomas Jefferson, that Martha Wales, Jefferson's wife, and Sally Hemings have the same father. They are half-sisters. Okay? The other thing that's worth noting is that Martha, Jefferson's eldest daughter, and Sally were born within a year apart. And so what that means is that they are experiencing their childbearing years together. They are raising their children. Jefferson's daughter, Martha, and Sally Hemings are raising their children together. As I say, Sally Hemings will have 4, and Jefferson will have 4 surviving children. Beverly, born in 1798, Harriet, 1801, James Madison in 1805, and Thomas Eston in 1808. So, although all 3 women, Martha, Maria, and Harriet, share the same father, their experiences of life will be very, very different, shaped entirely by the laws of Virginia that, since the 17th century, had relegated to a lifetime of enslavement all children born to enslaved women, and then, of course, a lifetime of freedom to all children born of free women. And as these 3 girls grow up, they will be educated to and learn their respective conditions in life. So for Martha and Maria, that will mean lessons in music, drawing, dancing, reading and writing, ciphering, French, Italian, and Spanish. When she becomes a mother herself, Martha will add Latin for her daughters. And so while Jefferson served as ambassador to France, Martha spent almost 5 years in the most exclusive convent school in Paris. And this is a partial view. The entire complex is about 2/3 of the length of a football field. So there she is, studying with the daughters of aristocrats and diplomats in terms of their letters to her. Here's my favorite, Marie Bottido. She will go to the theater. Here's the Comédie Française exterior and the magnificent interior. And socializing at the famous Palais Royal, which just opened actually in 1784, the year that Jefferson and Martha arrive in Paris, and is, as you can see, a kind of Parisian playground. Maria, accompanied by her 14-year-old enslaved maid, Sally Hemings, will join Jefferson and Martha in Paris in the last 2 years of that 5-year stay. So, 2 months after their return to Monticello in December 1789, Martha married Thomas Mann Randolph. The new Mrs. Randolph was all of 17 years old. Over the course of 28 years, she bore 12 children, of whom 11 survived. And here's a painting of her done in Philadelphia, actually, in 1834. It's a rather flattering portrait. She was just about 60. Can't really tell from this. And it's from the letters and memoirs and diaries of these children, particularly her daughter, Ellen, seen here, that I learned so much about what it was like to grow up white in this elite family on Jefferson's Little Mountain. So this is where I saw their joy in their lessons and quiet time for learning and reading, in their grandfather's gifts to them, the dresses and guitars and a desk, books, and in the admiration of visitors who praise their manners, elegance, and beautiful, elegant conversation. This is also, frankly, where I saw their snobbery as they looked down on all people that they deemed less educated, refined, and frankly, not Jefferson people, right, as they were. Harriet Hemings had a different childhood. She was born in May 1801, just after her father had left Monticello for Washington to take the oath of office as our third president. Born to a slave, she too was enslaved, but with a difference. Unlike her mother, Harriet grew up knowing that she was going to be freed at age 21. Harriet Hemings spent her childhood at her mother's side. That's a simple observation, but it packs a punch. Harriet was raised by a woman whose experiences as a young girl set her apart from every other slave at Monticello. Sally Hemings had survived the perils of transatlantic travel and had lived in Paris for 2 years. So here's an 18th century image of Paris and one of the very famous bridges. This bridge, actually, Jefferson would have crossed as he was making his way from where he lived to Pantamont, to the girls' school. And here's a typical bridge scene, crowded with all manner of people. So there in Paris, Sally Hemings experienced the sights and the sounds of that glittering city. She mixed with other people of color to whom her brother James introduced her. James had gone to France with Jefferson and Martha. She learned to speak French. She watched the beginnings of revolution, and she knew enough about French law regarding slavery to know that if she chose, she could remain in France a free woman. So it's from this exceptional mother who had seen that another type of life was possible, Harriet would have learned how to prepare for her life in freedom. Sally would have passed to Harriet all the skills she had learned in Paris and at Monticello that would have been expected of a properly raised young white woman. The ability to sew, to care for a range of fabrics and garments, how to manage a home. Harriet may have even had the polish of a smattering of French, since her mother was fluent in that language. Not until she was 14 years old did Harriet appear as a worker in Jefferson's farm book, which was sort of his record of his plantations. And she was one of 5 spinners in his textile manufactory, which building still stands today, just down the path from the main house, literally 30 steps away. And here's the spinning jenny, this hot new invention that she would have worked. Now, the fact that she didn't go to work until she was 14 deviated from the norm that Jefferson set down for every other enslaved child on his plantation, in which children under 10 served as babysitters. Between 10 and 16 years of old, these are Jefferson's words, the boys make nails and the girls spin, and then at 16 he decides what the fate of their life is going to be from that point, whether they are going to do field work or whether they are going to work in trades, or whether they're going to do skilled labor. Jefferson's overseer recalled that Harriet never did any hard work, suggesting to me that Harriet might not have taken her work in that manufactory all that seriously. but Jefferson did. Sally Hemings was never going to be like, Sally Hemings' daughter was never going to be like his other daughters or granddaughters. Not for her would they be training on the harpsichord, guitar, or in Latin. The intellectual activities and feminine accomplishments that were so critical to the Randolph girls' sense of themselves as elite women and the settings in which they would display them. So this is Jefferson's parlor at Monticello. Here is a harpsichord that he bought for Mariah. There was many a family wedding in this parlor. So these settings in which they would display their accomplishments would not be part of Harriet Hemings' training for adulthood. And as I continue here, I just want to have, for contrast, these two views. This is the interior of a newly constructed Hemings cabin, right? So when Sally Hemings came back from France, she first lived actually in what became the textile manufactory. But then Jefferson moved her out of there so he could lodge his white workers who were going to do all the renovations that he was going to do on his house. And so he built this cabin for Sally and her sister, Critta. And I just want you to compare this with something of the life of the Jefferson, the Randolph girls, right? Jefferson's, this is the dining room at Monticello. So I'm always asked, how did these women interact with each other? Did Martha ever acknowledge Harriet as her half-sister? Did Martha's daughters think of Sally as their aunt and Sally's children as their cousins? There's nothing in Martha's letters to answer any of these questions, but there are plenty of clues to be found nonetheless that give us a sense of the kinds of lessons about rank and status that she and Martha and her daughters would have taught the Hemings women about theirs. For example, when Ellen moved and married to Boston, her comparison between the free-wage laborers, servants, up there in Boston and enslaved labor that she had here at Monticello unwittingly gives us a glimpse of the life at Monticello. Unlike elite Southern girls this brand new bride was finding, Northern ones, quote, take care to require from the servants no running about from place to place, adding that Boston girls, quote, left no clothes tossed about nor drawer open, combs, pins, curls, ribbons, trinkets here and there on the dressing table, shoes in the middle of the floor, and so forth, unquote. Watching her relatives spending their days picking up after the thoughtless Randolph girls would have taught Harriet a great deal about the privileges of whiteness and the place of slaves. And it was an important distinction that Martha, their mother, was determined to preserve. A Jefferson biographer recounted how Martha was pushed to the breaking point one day by a poem she had read that alleged that Jefferson, quote, dreams of freedom in his bondmaid's arms, unquote. She stormed into her father's library, waving the offending poem in her hand. Quote, Mr. Jefferson broke into a hearty, clear laugh, unquote, which Martha, of course, chose to read as a denial. But the question never receded. How could it? When she was confronted daily with her father's visage in at least 2 of Sally's 3 sons. It bothered Martha's son Jeff as well. He once said that, quote, the resemblance was so close that at some distance or in the dusk, the slave, dressed in the same way, might be mistaken for Mr. Jefferson. There was even the time, Jeff said, when, quote, a gentleman dining here with Mr. Jefferson looked so startled as he raised his eyes from the latter to the servant behind him that his discovery of the resemblance was perfectly obvious to all. As Martha once said, she had endured, quote, the discomfort of slavery, unquote, all her life. If she had had her way, Sally Hemings and her children would have been moved off that mountain years before. That never happened, yet she still strove in her mind to protect her father's memory. Not long before her death, she asked her sons to check their grandfather's records, directing them to notice that Jefferson had not been at Monticello for a full 15 months before the conception of one of the Hemings children. Actually, his records proved exactly the opposite. But in bidding her children to, quote, remember this fact, unquote, I can't help but think it's a forerunner of today's alternative facts, she taught them to follow her own example. Ellen, her daughter, was an astute pupil. There are such things, after all, as moral impossibilities, she declared flatly, refuting Jefferson's accusers. So, schooled then by their mother and their grandfather in the habits and attitudes of white slaveholding Virginians, the Randolph girls would have given Harriet Hemings daily lessons in what it meant to be a slave. The curtain of silence that Jefferson drew down around his life with Sally Hemings veils the character of the daily contacts between Sally's children and Martha's. We simply don't know. But the Randolphs' later actions reveal what they were taught about slaves and about people of color, and I'm pretty sure that those attitudes would have been inscribed in every look, gesture, and comment directed towards Harriet. That the Randolphs were as discomfited by their mother, by the yellow children, as Ellen called them, is apparent in their various attempts to explain them away. In 1858, Ellen wrote a long letter to her husband Joseph explaining that, quote, there is a general impression that the 4 children of Sally Hemings were all the children of Colonel Carr, whose deeds are as well known as his name. He had something of a reputation for being let's just say a ladies' man. Ellen stated categorically that it was Jefferson's principle to, quote, allow such of his slaves as were sufficiently white to pass for white men to withdraw quietly from the plantation. It was called running away, she explained, but they were never reclaimed. So then, to her, there was nothing notable, as she tried to argue then, about the, quote, 4 instances of this, 3 young men and 1 girl, who walked away and stayed away. They were left to themselves, for they were white enough to pass for white. Interestingly, her brother Jeff fingered another one of the Carr men as the father of Sally Hemings' children, so clearly they couldn't get their story straight. And this is a photograph of 2 enslaved children from Louisiana. The photograph was actually taken in New York City in 1863, but I want us to so be clear. I think there's a way in which in our distance from slavery we imagine all enslaved people as possessing dark skin. They do not, right? And clearly showing the results of interracial sex. So the point that I'm trying to make with Ellen and Jeff is that both worked hard to preserve that sharp line between free white family and the enslaved one, even as Jefferson remained mute on the subject. There are other points to consider here as we think about Harriet's interactions with the Randolphs at Monticello. One is the way in which Ellen talked about Sally Hemings and her children. Although she had known Sally all her life and knew that she was light-colored because Sally Hemings was 3/4 white, Ellen nonetheless still referred to her as Dusky Sally, the denigrating name that had been given to her in sensationalized print stories almost 60 years before. On the other hand, when Harriet's brother Madison told his family story to an Ohio newspaper in 1873, he named every single one of Martha's 11 surviving children, while Ellen had just referred vaguely to the 3 young men and 1 girl. For Ellen, it didn't matter who Harriet's father was. All Ellen had to do was just look past her and, in her willful blindness, deprive Harriet even of her name to ensure that Harriet understood her place. And in her feigned ignorance of their names, Ellen would like us to read this insurmountable distance between the life she lived and the life that the Hemings lived. But she did know them. She grew up alongside of them, and as long as the stories linking them to Jefferson continued to circulate, she could hardly be indifferent. In fact, the whole point of Ellen's letter to her husband, to whom I should say, by this point, she's been married to him for 28 years, and I'm thinking they've discussed this before. But the whole point of her letter was to establish her credentials as Jefferson's legitimate descendant and to consign her cousins to nameless oblivion, erasing Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston from contention. Ellen was also grossly indifferent to the plight of all the other female slaves at Monticello, who she even admitted were at the mercy of the Irish workmen and the, quote, dissipated young men in the neighborhood, unquote, and who subsequently bore those yellow children that visitors to the plantation frequently remarked upon. Ellen's letter makes clear how little she thought of the humanity of the enslaved women who spent their days picking up after her and her sisters, but then suffered unprotected the sexual assaults of her grandfather's hired help and her brother Jeff's schoolmates. To Ellen, slaves were inferior beings no matter what their skin color may be. So certain was she of that view, when she praised the freedom of American women over English, she effortlessly omitted slavery from the equation, not unlike her grandfather had done when he wrote All Men Are Created Equal. Quote, putting domestic slavery out of the question, she wrote, it's never been my lot to see anything like oppression of the many by the few, unquote. Wow. Yeah. Fully immersed in, one might say, co-opted by a patriarchal worldview, Ellen completely excised slavery from consideration so that she could then render her judgment that American women were the freest in the world. In a society that sidelined well-educated and well-connected women, Ellen resorted to the lessons of white supremacy that she had learned all her life to offset her gender inferiority with racial superiority. She saw where power and authority resided, and she allied herself with it, right, with white men. And for all her brilliance and wit, her letters gave me literally laugh out loud moments in the archives. People would look at me like, I want what she's reading. But for all her wit, she didn't change this hierarchical world. She perpetuated it. Harriet Hemings left Monticello at age 21 and effected her own Declaration of Independence from her enslaved origins. Passing as a free-born white woman, she married a white man, raised a family, and disappeared from the historical record. But her strategy to claim the privileges of whiteness, however successful, and they were, extracted an egregious cost. Exile from her family, the silencing of her voice, and the denial of her Hemings family lineage. So I think these stories offer a powerful lesson for our own day. White and black women have been conditioned by an authority system that profits from keeping us divided and in tension. So this evening I wonder, Are we willing to sacrifice our discomfort in our respective spaces for the greater good of a conversation? Will we truly listen to each other's experiences? Will we legitimate each other's stories with our acceptance? And how can we learn from the past, and where can we go on this campus from here? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kerrison. Clearly we don't have to go much further than history to get our next soap opera novels. I mean, this is an amazing
I'll send my book to Tom Hanks.
Right, description of, but yet what strikes me in both reading, I'm not quite finished, but in reading your book and also in what you've spoken is how some of the themes that you talk about are resonant with today's discussions that you alluded to at the very beginning here, and that these tensions that may occur among women rather than feeling that women are united in their approach to combating systematic oppression is that we tend to get sucked into our different forms of it. One of the reasons that we study history is to be able to inform where we are today and hopefully learn from that as well. And so we thought that in hearing from Dr. Kerrison's book, it would be good for us to also hear from you all in your response to how you think it reflects on today. So we asked two students to provide their perspectives and their response to Dr. Kerrison's work. So I'm going to introduce them each, but we're going to start with Chichi Chioke. So if you want to come on up. Chichi is a first-year student from Nigeria, and she's a student at the business school here. Her major is finance, and she plans to be an investment banker. So we've asked Chichi to provide her response and her remarks. So thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Chichi, as you know, and I moved to America last summer to go to school here. I work with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion with Dr. Dwyer, Dr. Nance, and Ariella Bradley. Most of you know who they are. And our goal is to actively forge committed relationships across and through lines of difference. So I'd like to thank Professor Catherine Kerrison for writing this book and exploring the intricate relationship between white women and women of color. I believe it's a discussion that we must have if we plan to move forward as a group of women all over the world. So, reflecting on this book, my mind travels to home. Many people don't know, but there are a lot of white women in Nigeria. Most people don't know this, but the dynamic is so different there. Like, everyone is welcome, it's like welcome home. There's a common way we address each other. Often you hear things like, "How are you, my sister?" Or the older women will say to your younger children, whether or not you're related, you might not even know them. It's, "How are you, my daughter?" So we recognize that whoever you are, whatever the color your skin is, wherever you come from, what race, class, you are one of us. You are a woman, and just reading this book took my mind back there, and I realized that on campus, it's not the same. We all just move with the people that we know. The black girls move with the black girls, the white ones with the white ones, the Asian ones with the Asian ones, and we don't work together. And I feel like the women of minority, we clinch so tightly to the wrongdoings of the past and present. And I feel some white women also are not sensitive enough to realize that these things actually happened. And they forget that these things happened. So when they try to relate, there's so much tension and it doesn't work out. And then also thinking about this, so I'm reading a book called The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And on relationships between black and white people. This is what he said. He said, "Many of them indeed know better, but as you will discover, people find it difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds and hearts of most white Americans at the time is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shivering and all the stars ablaze. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. I feel like this perfectly describes the situation we were faced with in Jefferson's Daughters. The white women that we encounter in this narrative had for so long been the definition of what it meant to be women, white, affluent, and educated. To them, Sally and Harriet were not women. They were just slaves. It was difficult for the white women to redefine what it meant to be a woman because they had never before encountered another type of woman that wasn't what they were used to. And these feelings were not just uniquely those of the Jefferson women, but most white middle-class women of the time, 19th century. The most ironic thing is that around this same time, we experienced the first wave of feminism. So how could they, as white women, be fighting for the rights of women, but in their very households, black women were bruised, enslaved, battered, and they pretended not to see it, or they decided not to. And at the first Women's Convention in 1848 in Ohio, not surprisingly, most of the attendees were white women, educated white women. But then suddenly, Sojourner Truth walks in. For those of you who don't know, Sojourner Truth was a slave herself. She was about 6 feet tall, who bore the scars of brutal beatings, the sale of her 13 children into slavery, and the loss of her own parents. Her presence stirred fear. The white women at the conference didn't want to soil their struggle and demand for women's rights with the uncomfortable subject of race and the rights of black people. Yet when Sojourner rose to join the conversation, her words collected under the title, "Ain't I a woman?" In other words, too, ain't I a sister? She not only drew the strong admiration of all the people present, but intimated what would come to be the fundamental question of Western feminism. Who exactly is a woman? Who is a sister? We all are. The poor woman, the uneducated one, the immigrant, the disabled one, the European, the American, the white, the black, the African, the Asian, the Latin American, the lesbian, the transgender. We all are. We ought to be sisters. And whether we like to admit it or not, none of us is free when any woman is unfree, even when her shackles may be different from our own. It is not our differences that divide us, but it is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. United we stand, but divided we fall. So to answer the question, I think we can be sisters, but a lot needs to be done before we get there. A lot of forgiveness, commitment and perseverance, letting go, humility, faith, and finally love for this sisterhood to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Chichi. Those were wonderful words, and if you haven't turned that into a paper, you should. Next, I'd like to invite Claire Grinninger up. Claire's a sophomore from Dallas, Texas. She's studying peace and justice and Arab Islamic studies. On campus, she serves on the leadership team for the Association for Change and Transformation, ACT, Get Woke Nova, and the Villanova Feminism Society. She hopes to go into immigration law while constantly developing her Arabic language skills and hearing different perspectives from people around the world. So, Claire, thank you.
Hello, everybody. Before I start, I wanted to say that initially I wanted to begin saying where I grew up and where I come from. I'm from Dallas, Texas. Like a lot of Villanovans, I come from a predominantly white community, and I was raised with the help of a black nanny who is very close to me and very dear to me. I was thinking about articulating the fact that I never had to think about my race until I came to Villanova, and I learned to become very close friends with those who don't look like me. However, in articulating this, I was given the attention by Dr. Nance, who told me about the standpoint theory. For those of you who do not know, the standpoint theory is where people of a minority perspective know the narrative of the majority inside and out. So in articulating my story, it kind of becomes redundant to those who are from a more minority perspective. So I wanted to go forth recognizing that. Another thing I realized from this lecture is that the importance of feminism and the fact that feminism without being intersectional is not feminism at all. So without recognizing the women who do not look like me, without recognizing those who are different, and without calling them my sisters and my friends, I cannot claim to fight for the rights of all people unless I learn to recognize them first. Another important theme I found in this lecture was the theme of active acknowledgement and consent. So a big part of Thomas Jefferson and a big part of his criticism is that in relationship with Sally Hemings, that relationship is not consensual in any way. Having a relationship with a master and a slave is, of course, rape, because you cannot be consensual if you are not free. So I think going forth that has repercussions at Villanova as well. It is important to acknowledge the constant factor of consent here and all the actions we do. Another thing that Dr. Nance taught me was the idea of the panopticon, so that women are constantly analyzing themselves and critiquing themselves in order to fall under the male gaze. That falls in the same category as consent in my mind, where in a way women are forced to go in a certain pathway that in most cases the man wants to seek approve of. So I think that it's important to recognize that feminism in and of itself must be intersectional, so that the voices who are not heard and who are underrepresented must be amplified by women who are given the microphone where others are not. I see too often on this campus women with, say, laptop stickers or stickers on their water bottle with feminism, empowered women empower women, and so much more, but yet I don't see those women show up at certain events we have on campus that appreciate women of color and other people of color. They kind of stray away from that in a way that I think is not truly empowering all women. Lastly, I would like to articulate the fact that majority of the people on this campus, although we may speak few things in words of equality and empowerment, we do little to nothing. And by doing nothing, we're saying with the unjust and violent status quo that does not treat particularly women equally today. And so I urge you all to use your voices that we have as being educated people who were welcomed into a selective university where others were not, to use our voices to amplify, not to replace, but to amplify those who are underrepresented and who don't get the microphone like we do. Thank you so much.
I'm continuously amazed by our students here, and thank you so much for sharing your personal perspectives on this. But now I want to invite you to share any reflections that you might have had. Now, before we do that, I want to lay a couple of ground rules. a theme through everything that was said up here is this concept of discomfort, right? That perhaps is driving some of this, but also that what we're going to be saying here are things that many of us shouldn't be comfortable with, right? And so, but as such, I think that whomever is going to come up and speak, we should provide first the opportunity to listen without judgment, and then that is where the beginning of this kind of conversation and dialogue happens, to understand these perspectives that we're sharing here are our own deeply held perspectives, but as you heard from our first three speakers, there are things that unless we examine and truly acknowledge, we're not going to get to that next step that Chichi and Claire and Dr. Kerrison alluded to in their talks. So, do we have any brave souls that would either like to come up, or you can even speak from there if you'd like?
Maybe stand in there.
Standing in your seat is fine. I don't know that I can share the microphone, but. How many of you felt that any one of the statements that people said up here were things that they resonated with personally? How many of you felt that the historical piece that Dr. Kerrison described to resonated with today? Right. So in what ways do you think you could share? And even if it's not a personal story, maybe something else that you feel. Yeah, a comment or a question, or even a question of Dr. Kerrison about some of the work that she had done, or the groups that Chichi and Claire are engaged with on campus. Yes.
I find it really fascinating that as women, most of us, and I think even today, things haven't changed that much. We experience oppression in certain ways. And then as a group, we cannot translate that into racial solidarity between races. That we, without realizing it, we often draw these borders around race.
We get sucked into the oppression, right?
Yes.
And we co-opt it for ourselves, if you will. Right. We haven't gotten that far in 200 and how many years?
200 years? Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is we can talk about it today, but we still don't follow through with our actions, as I pointed out. So we talk about it. We have conversations about race. We have conversation about gender, and then in our daily lives, a lot of things go down that really are the opposite of what we're talking about.
What do you think blocks us from the conversation to action? And anyone can respond to this.
Action is uncomfortable. It takes you out of your comfort zone, so you have to make an effort. You can read a piece in a newspaper, you can agree, you can discuss, but then to go out on the street or really to go that extra mile, that is really tough. It's intentional, right?
Yeah. I think it's also in part threatening to our identities, right? And I don't remember which of you three fabulous speakers said it, but it's painful to kind of tear at that identity that you've held for so long, and to give that up, and in part as a white woman to give up that status of better, right? Which to me Martha so clearly constructed, Martha and Ellen, and you know, so if I'm not as good as a man, I'm better than you, right. You know, and that, you know, is it's comforting to some extent, right? So it pushes us away from that discomfort.
Well, it also means you have to acknowledge that you're a victim. I think they didn't want to say I'm a victim too, but that's tough to. It's better to see yourself as on the winning side.
Right, right. Should I see another hand? No? Okay. Go ahead.
You also, in response to what you said, a way to, I'm sorry, okay. The way to incite women to act, perhaps, could be education. In the education, in a lot of schools, like a lot of like privileged schools, you don't see history about Black history or the history of minorities. It's about the white history and what they did, all the successes that they did. So from the beginning, your view of like the world is already myopic. So I feel like we could start from there.
I think to your point, Chichi, you know, when we do learn Black history, we learn it as Black history, right? Right. We don't learn, and the same to some extent with women's history, right? So we don't necessarily read history as, we don't qualify as white male. We qualify as history, right? But we don't bring those other inclusive viewpoints in. But when you do, and you say, oh, we're going to look at Black history, we're not saying it's our history. I'm not claiming it as my history. We're claiming it as Black history, right? And the same with women's history. And so you say, how do you engage men in that? It's women's history. It's not, you know, my history. It's not our history. And being more inclusive in our education systems of those multiple perspectives is one, I think, good way to talk about that. Is that a hand or okay? Yes.
I was as like a question, how does the presence of like, if we said the conversations and then just like Dr. Kerrison's and classes in general, how do they kind of affect the conversations that are had on like Villanova's campus? I know they're not conversations that people are going to have in their dorm rooms or in their lounges, et cetera, but like there's the presence definitely affects something. So I was just wondering what everyone's thoughts were on how the growing prominence affects Villanova.
Well, I have to tell you that as in the role that I'm playing, I'm hoping that these conversations do happen in our dorm rooms eventually, that growing prominence leads to like more of this discussion beyond this formal atmosphere of that it becomes something that we take on. But I also acknowledge that cultural change like that takes a lot, right? And so I'm interested to hear anybody else's response to what you had to say. Yes.
Real loud.
Yeah, yeah.
This was just like kind of on my mind because I just literally took the senior survey. It was about Villanova versus other schools. And I know that
I'm sorry?
is it the McNulty at the as well? So I was just wondering kind of like what you guys thought about Villanova versus other schools, kind of what like McNulty's doing here to change that.
So does anybody want to answer about like other schools?
What do
Or?
you think? I mean, in the survey, I kind of agree with everybody. I don't think it's Villanova is doing so for schools, not that it's
White?
May I just share an experience? So, I've been here about 2.5 years, and I have had experience in many different areas, other institutions I mean. But I went to a rheumatologist, an older gentleman. He was white male doctor. And as he's keying in my information, he's asking all of these questions. What do I do? And to determine, you know, the effects on my joints, what type of work do I do? So I said, you know, I'm an assistant. Okay, where do you work? I said, I work at Villanova. Okay, well, what kind of work do you do? Well, I'm the assistant to the president. And he stops mid-typing and looks at me and says, you're executive assistant to the president at Villanova. And I said, yes. He says, that's got to be the whitest institution. And he's a white man saying this to me. And he told me, next time I see you, I want you to tell me how that is. So just internal to us, but there are, you know, other people outside of our institution, and I don't know how he knew that or why he felt that way, but you know, I share that same question that you had, how are things here and how the other people feel about that compared to other people, especially students. Yes.
I definitely feel like I've been lucky with like the people that I'm friends with. 'Cause I feel like I'm friends with like a lot of different races, and like I haven't just like tried to think to like just like Asians or like Korean people. And I feel like it's partly because I came from a really diverse town, where we like had these kind of conversations often. But I also feel like it's part of like the amount of effort that you put in and like how open-minded you are about like listening to other people's stories, because a lot of the times I feel like people are afraid to be like called out for like saying something that's like unpopular, or like they're afraid to share their stories and like be vulnerable. But I feel like as a person, if you're just like ready to listen and you're just not gonna be judgmental up front, it definitely helps the situation. So I've been lucky to have like conversations in my dorm and like at the spit. And I feel like it's all about like the actions that you take, and like you get to choose like what kind of characteristics you like possess. So I feel like I was lucky in my freshman year that way.
To form those
Yeah.
relationships.
Yeah.
I think definitely as a student, Villanova has some work to do with any institution, but I know as I was looking at colleges, my mom was like, really, Villanova? She wanted me to go to Howard, which is a HBCU, Spelman, anything but Villanova. I grew up in a very, predominantly white community, and I was always the one black girl in the class, and I wasn't. He used to call me an Oreo, say I was white on the inside but black on the outside. That's because the way I speak, which is a whole other conversation in itself.
Right.
But my mom sat me down and she was like, Villanova's a really good school. She's like, but it's going to be the same thing you had in high school, middle school, and elementary school. She's like, are you sure you want to do the same thing? And I grew up with great friends, great high school, great schooling. It was, I don't pay attention to where I am, but it's definitely interesting here. Like, we have a long way to come, long way to go. I mean, I'm a Blue Key tour guide, and I had a person come up to me and say, we don't want to talk to you about our experiences, because what your experiences are, because your experience as a black student is going to be the same as my daughter's white. So, it's just things
No sisterhood there, right?
No, it's just, and they're like, oh, how does it feel to be black at Villanova? You get those questions a lot, and I think it's definitely something as an institution we have to work on. Definitely diversity and inclusion, but you can see like Get Woke, Nova, just different things happening on campus. You can see the change happening, but I just think it really comes down to the students. Like, how are we going to act? Are we going to stay together, or are all the African American students going to be together? All the the white students going to be together. And like you said, it really takes you having an open mind and listening. But I'm telling you, my mom was like, really?
So, can I ask, because I really like what you said about having the conversations, right? That understanding what we perceive now as other, as same, or as sister, requires talking and understanding and gaining a knowledge of that experience. And there are certain things that are growing at Villanova that we're trying to foster. The brand new McNulty Institute takes an intersectional approach to feminism, so but we don't have programs yet, right? So we're working to build them. But everything that the Institute is doing is in collaboration with our partners like the Office for Diversity and Inclusion. And the university's new strategic plan, it's not a problem that Villanova doesn't know that it has. How's that? In answer to your question. And I'm glad that you took the senior survey, because that sort of feedback helps get better information to inform what we're about to be doing in our strategic plan. One of the key components of which is building a more inclusive environment. And those of us who are working on this are focused on, it's an inclusive environment isn't about representation, it's about feeling included, right? And there's a big difference between that. And believe it or not, I'm a graduate of Villanova myself. I graduated 20 years ago. But when I was here, it was even more white, and it's actually diversified, unfortunately, significantly, given everything that we've just said. It's a different institution than it was when I was here, but at the same time, that perception and that dialogue may not exist. So the numbers aren't the answer. The answer is the conversation, the understanding of others' experiences and perspectives, and that the groups that we talked about becoming more woven into the fabric of Villanova's culture versus pop-up side groups is something that I think is going to be really helpful to that. What about others?
This is actually a question because I read the book and loved it, but my question is, like, even when you're reading it, you're like, don't go back to Monticello. Like, why doesn't Sally Hemings stay in France? I mean, I noticed, like, if you come back, your kids will have freedom when they're 21, but just stay there and you can be free now. Like, why did she take that path back to being a slave?
The question is, why, knowing she could be free, she stayed in France, did Sally Hemings go back to Monticello? The short answer is we can't know for sure, although I have to recommend a book called The Hemingses of Monticello by Annette Gordon-Reed. It won a Pulitzer Prize, and she devotes a whole chapter really to kind of that question. And I think it could be for any number of reasons. So one is the kind of isolation she might have experienced had she stayed in Paris. I mean, she was trained as a kind of as a chambermaid, and in fact Jefferson would periodically, not regularly, pay her a wage comparable to what French women would have made there. And the reason I wonder about this most is because her brother James, Jefferson took over to Paris when they went in the summer of 1784, and he wanted James to train as a French chef. Like, that was the whole point of bringing him over. And James, one suspects, had ideas about staying in France himself because the wages that Jefferson paid him to be a chef, he used, among other things, to take French lessons, not the French that he was learning sort of from the riffraff on the Parisian streets, but the kind of French that would be spoken in aristocratic households, which suggests to me that maybe James had plans about not the heck going back to Virginia. But I think with Sally, I think there is. Her mother was there. Her mother, Elizabeth Hemings, had 14 children, 7 by white men and 7 by enslaved men. So, which is to say, and the Hemingses were a huge extended family, but also very tightly knit. And I think the prospect of living without ever seeing them again was one reason why she chose to go back. Another is that there was, and I guess this is sort of one thing where I'd want to offer something that Claire said that I'd want us to think about, that under the circumstances of Sally Hemings' enslavement, she never could have made this decision couldn't have been consensual. It's not the same as a free man and a free woman, even in the 18th century. But the fact that she chose to go back, her son Madison told the story of what happened in Paris. And I thought it was interesting that Madison talks about his mother entering essentially into a treaty with their father, right? Which doesn't sound too terribly romantic to me, right? So I'm not painting this as a romance. I think how I would see her decision is, I have a choice of staying in this place where I have learned skills, I know the language, I could make it work. I mean, none of them, even Jefferson, whose job as ambassador was to tell the US government what was happening in France, said, no worries about about a revolution, things would have calmed down, right? So no one, not even Sally Hemings, would know that their plans to work for aristocrats would very shortly have been destroyed. I do think I see her return as a calculation that allows her to see her family, to go back to that gorgeous place. Other slaves, I mean, even after the Civil War, former slaves of Jefferson's go back to Monticello. They just want to see, I'm thinking of Peter Fawcett, who was 10 years old when he was put on the auction block after Jefferson died. And he goes back as an older man, and because he wants to see his home, right? And so I think this is sort of an acknowledgement of the ways in which enslaved populations do have lives and create lives, apart from, I mean, I'm not minimizing what slavery is, right? But also I don't want us to see the Hemingses or any other enslaved people as these passive victims who can do nothing and have no choices. And so I think she thought, I can go back to Monticello, I can see my family again, with my body, unlike the laws in Virginia that said anything that comes out of my body as an enslaved woman will be a slave, with my body, I stopped for my family that process, right? And that maybe she would even be in a position as and there is no word, she wasn't a mistress because he wasn't married, and hardly a partner or but that's why I keep going back to one of Jefferson's neighbors' phrase, substitute for a wife, right? That as Jefferson's substitute for a wife, she would be in a position to, get some goodies for her family, like her extended family, right? So, yeah. It's a good question.
What strikes me so interestingly about this, and as I was even listening to, is like, why aren't we pissed as hell at Thomas Jefferson?
Yeah,
like, why are we talking about, and this gets to the sister's question, why are we talking about how why are they focusing their animosity, his granddaughters,
Right.
on the Hemingses,
Right.
when they should be pissed at him, right? That, and
Probably
that
for
gets
lots
to,
of reasons.
right, no, I get that, I mean, I understand that, but it's like, even in having this dialogue where we're creating more of that tension among us rather than focusing it on the person who did the deeds, right? So it's, I mean, and their deeds they're complicit, right? Or more so, yeah, in that, but at the same time, we need to be a little more mad at the father of our country, that we're focused on that.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to add or ask a question or comment even on this?
Can I just,
Sure.
I feel like coming to Villanova to study business would prepare me for that. Because in all my business classes, there are not that many girls first off, and I'm always the only person of color. So I always feel like I have to overexert myself to prove that I can do this, you know. So most of the classes, the guys they're surprised that, well, she had the highest grade in the class, you know, that kind of thing. So I feel like Villanova is training me for that. And like, as terrible as that sounds, I feel like Villanova is training me to be able to deal with that kind of atmosphere.
Can you share, Chichi, if you wouldn't mind, what you're doing this summer?
Over the summer, I'm interning at Princeton at EY. Oh, so I'm in a rotational program for 10 weeks. So we go through risk and advisory, treasury, tax, and at the end of the internship, you pick whichever one you want to work with for the next summer. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or comments that anybody wants to add?
Jay, can I ask a quick question, please? It's just sort of with the group. Where is the best place to kind of effect these conversations or keep things going? You know, on campus, yeah.
Or off campus, but with campus community.
Right,
right.
Right. I mean, I think there's a way in which, you know, hopefully perhaps something like this can be sort of helpful, but clearly
it needs to go further. We can't just have these conversations and then leave it, right? We need to.
So where do we have them, or do we? What would be kind of a, you know, a useful event or venue or series or?
IGR does a lot of stuff.
IGR does that.
How many people here have taken an IGR class? A couple. If you have the opportunity, and it's open to faculty and staff as well, you have the opportunity, and this is the sort of thing you're interested in, I highly recommend it, because it gets at exactly what we're talking about, like taking that dialogue to the next level of really understanding, and IGR stands for intergroup relations, right? And it tackles any number of identities that we represent. So gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, ability, religion, sexuality, all things that IGR has a focus on at different times. So I would also throw in a pitch for a newly born, soon to be born program, which is a multi-institute ambassadors program. We're looking to get individuals who are interested in developing leadership skills around social change with a focus on gender, but inclusive of different perspectives. And there's a flyer with information about that. And if you are graduating, you don't have to, we will be looking next year to be adding alumni ambassadors, so that's another piece that we look, and faculty and staff next year as well. So providing that opportunity too, so check it out. And stop by my office anytime. I'm actually in the president's office, but it's an open door, so anytime if you want to just stop by, learn more about the Institute. Gender and Women's Studies is open as well, and then the Office for Diversity and Inclusion, which is in the law school at the moment, but will soon be becoming neighbors with the Institute in Tolentine next year at some point. We're going to be focusing an actual space on this issue as well at the university. So, thank you all for coming.